specifically Matthew 15, verse 21. We good to go over there? Okay. Well, as I have been for many months, Matthew's fourth section, as I have broken out Matthew's Gospel, which I take that from being close to the end of chapter 12 through to about the middle of chapter 16, that is section 4, which I've titled with this summary statement, that Jesus has disciples who believe the signs while the opposition becomes more stubborn. And that really is the general trend both ways throughout this part of the gospel. People becoming kind of more extreme in their allegiances or their lack of allegiance to Christ. And I've spent one message already on this passage. I have 3 messages total planned for our current passage, which is Matthew 15, verses 21 through 28, which I'll go ahead and read. It says, "And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. And behold, a Canaanite woman from that region came out and was crying, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.' But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and begged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she is crying out after us.' He answered, 'I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel.' But she came and knelt before him, saying, 'Lord, help me.' And he answered, 'It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.' And she said, 'Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table.' And Jesus answered her, 'O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire.' And her daughter was healed instantly." Now, in summary, Matthew records this event to show the very strange beginning of the long-awaited grace of God toward Gentiles. And I've discussed this already somewhat in my last message. Last time I wanted to make you appreciate the role of this story as the beginning of that work. And I spent the entire message on that point. It took us all over the Old Testament and through the first half of Matthew just to show you how there are these promises, and to some degree things have been gearing up in this direction in the first half of Matthew, but Jesus really hasn't gone all the way here and actually just shown any kind of unapologetic, unhindered, clear grace to a Gentile because of a Gentile's request. It hasn't really happened yet until this story. Now, that was last time, just showing you how this really is the beginning of all those promises coming to fruition. But today I want to stay in this passage and try to understand its details and its purpose a little better. So we're not jumping around very much. We're just going to stay here and focus on what's going on in this story. And speaking of the purpose of this passage, asking this question, just why is this here anyway? I mean, why has Matthew recorded this story, and what is he trying to do with it? Well, in this story, I really think that Matthew is trying to help his readers with a very difficult issue for the Jewish church, specifically the Jewish readers of Matthew that were reading his gospel. And that very difficult question that they're asking is how to relate to Gentile Christians. So Jewish Christians asking how to relate to Gentile Christians. Now, Jews, for those of you that still not familiar with the parlance here, Jews are people who belong to the nation of Israel. This is the nation where God did most of his works in throughout the whole first part of the Bible. And then Gentiles are everyone else. So everyone else in the world, including the people in this room, those are the Jews over there, and the Gentiles are over here. Very different people groups. Now, in the modern worldwide church, of course, we are 99% Gentile. For the most part, the Jews have just not followed their Messiah at all, and most Christians throughout the world are in fact non-Jews. They're Gentiles. But we must remember that there was a time when the church was 99% Jewish. It was the other way around. And it was very, very few people from a Gentile background that were actually Christians. And those Jewish Christians who made up 99% of Christianity did not really want Gentile Christians. It was a really big problem back then. They didn't really know what to make of these people that were interested in Jesus, but who were not Jewish. So that was sort of the tension back then. And Matthew, he needs to deal with this problem. he needs to address this issue that is very prevalent for his own readers. And in this story about Jesus, I think he sees a great chance to talk about that very thing. I think he can use this story for that issue. And that, I think, is why this story is really here. It doesn't just show the beginning of this move of God's grace among the Gentiles. It actually has a very great purpose for Matthew's readers in teaching them how to think about this in their lives. So I'm calling this message, this particular message, just a case study of a Gentile believer. So we're going to look at this woman here who is a Gentile, who is to some degree believing in Christ, and we're going to study her, and we're going to use that as an example of other Gentile believers. Now this story is going to provide great help for that difficult issue among the Jewish church to whom Matthew is writing about how to deal with people like this woman, these Gentiles who are interested in Jesus, who in some sense believe in Jesus, and what do we do with them? How do we handle these people? Now Matthew's readers, they need to know this story. That's my first point in my outline here. Number one point is that Matthew's readers need to know this story. And in case I don't really have you hooked yet as to why this is important, I'll show you in that first point why Matthew's readers need this story. Second point of my outline is that Matthew portrays this woman's situation exactly the way the Jewish Christian would see it. So that's pretty much the second point, that they're going to see in this woman every Gentile believer they've ever met so far. So then my third point is that Matthew shows why it's pointless to resist these Gentile Christians. Nothing, we're good? Yeah, so third point, Matthew's going to show why there is just no purpose in resisting this work of God among the Gentiles. And then finally, my fourth point is Matthew's going to provide Jesus as a model for accepting Gentile Christians. So the radical idea of asking Christians to act like Christ is going to come forth in that fourth point. So that's my outline. Now, before I get started there, I want to admit that this message, the way I have it preached here, is going to be only a very indirect application to us. It's not going to be the kind of thing that applies in a very direct sense to our lives, which is because we have no problem with Gentile Christians. We are Gentile Christians. We don't have any problem with the idea that non-Jews are coming to believe in Jesus. So this problem that I'm addressing tonight really was solved 2,000 years ago. So it's old news. It's very much old news. So I can't really make any claim that this is going to be some message that is going to open your eyes to something brand new, because it really isn't. But it does have some indirect application, I think. I think it gets you thinking in certain directions that are helpful. For one, I think this passage shows the importance of being open to change. You know, things that you always thought were right, you know, this is God's will, and turns out you're actually wrong and you need to rethink this whole thing. I think this passage very much moves along those lines. Secondly, I think this passage shows the value of gradual change rather than forcing people to accept ideas now or never. I think it's very important as we think about maybe things in our own lives or in our church life or whatever that maybe need to be different, not just ramming those things down people's throats, but working for change in a very gradual sense. I think this passage and this message that I have here moves along those ideas as well. I think this passage also sets up for a great lesson on prayer, which is my plan for my next message. So not really tonight, but I think as you see this woman and the way she pursues this request that she has, you see in her a model of pursuing with God the things you ask for in prayer. So I think there are lessons here for us. I think you just have to think outside of the immediate issue and just think about the kinds of things we're talking about. Not necessarily the issue of Gentile believers and how we deal with them, but just the way this is being handled by Matthew, the way Jesus conducts himself, and the general lessons we can learn from that. So I do think there are lessons here. You just got to think maybe a little bit outside of the actual message itself. But I'm going to get moving through my outline as I gave it with my first point here. And that is simply that Matthew's readers need to know this story. It is absolutely essential for them. Now, for this entire time in my study through Matthew, I've been assuming that Matthew writes to evangelize and to disciple Palestinian Jews. His purpose is twofold. He wants Jews to come to know Jesus as the Messiah, and he wants to train them in what it means to follow Jesus as the Messiah. Now, I see Matthew as being in or near the land of the Jews, Palestine, as you would call it in this era of history. I see him being either in that nation or nearby it, and he wants to write a gospel which speaks most directly to those Palestinian Jews, the Jews living in the Jewish homeland, his own people. And he first of all wants to convince them that Jesus is the Messiah. He wants to present the argument that this man that was condemned as a criminal 30 some odd years ago, guess what, really was the Christ. So you messed up, but now it's time to believe in him and repent of that and believe in him. And then secondly, after that, he wants to train them as Christians. He wants to show them what it means to live the Christian life, what that means for your thought life, what that means for your actions. He wants to disciple them. So that's his twofold plan for this gospel. Now, I came to that conclusion years ago, and it's not just me. That's a very common view of Matthew's gospel. And the reason is pretty simple. It's simply that as you read Matthew, if you read it against the backdrop of Judaism in the first century, it makes a lot of sense. The kinds of things Matthew says, the kinds of things he doesn't bother to say, the way he words things, those sorts of things, if you read his gospel against that kind of Jewish background, it all makes pretty good sense. And that's basically it. That's basically the only reason why you read the Gospel of Matthew that way, because it makes sense. So, here we are, Matthew writing his gospel to these Jews of Jews, these Jews living in the very homeland of the Jews. So, these Palestinian Jewish Christians, what are they like? Well, among other things, they probably have a huge problem accepting Gentile Christians. These Jewish Christians, probably not very easygoing with the topic of these people that are converted from paganism and coming to worship and follow Christ. Now, let's say that Matthew succeeds in his first goal of evangelizing Jews and convincing them to become Christians. And the churches there in Palestine are flooded with new converts. Let's say he accomplishes that. Well, that's a great victory, but it's just the first victory. Now you have to go on and you have to teach them to rethink centuries of misguided Jewish thought. Things that haven't necessarily been correct. Oh, sure, they've had the scriptures, but the way they've thought about those things and the way they've been living, not exactly right. And evangelizing the Jews may have been the easier part than actually training them to change their minds about some of these things that they've been holding on to for centuries. Now, in one point in particular, Matthew was sure to hit a problem, and that is that many Gentiles were also coming to believe that Jesus was the Messiah, especially outside of the land of the Jews, in other nations, but also within Palestine. There were Gentiles living in the land of the Jews. It wasn't a monolithic society because of the Roman ruling powers there and all the Gentile influence. There were Gentiles there, and they're hearing the gospel too. And there are Gentiles being converted, and that's what's happening. Now, first century Jews, however, are not usually going to be the most welcoming, open people. They are very narrow. When you just think about them in that point of time in history, they're the narrow-minded people of the Roman imperial world. They actually remind me very much of the ultra right-wing Americans. It's like, why are you coming to my country? Go home. We took this country first. That kind of thing. Well, the first century Jews are kind of like that. They're very much, we are the nation. The rest of you, get out. Get out of our way. We are God's people, not you. That's kind of the mentality. And they got that way after centuries of trouble with every single nation around them. After every single nation that's your neighbor invades you or conquers you, rules over you, enslaves you, you're going to have problems with your neighbors after all of that. And that's pretty much how they got to that point of having this great dislike of Gentiles. And that's where they are at this time. Now, when a person gets converted, when they become a Christian, not every single sin or problem goes away at once. It doesn't work that way. If it did work that way, there'd be no need to have any more preaching because we'd all be perfect. So if you were a Gentile-hating Jew before you were a Christian, you're probably going to be a Gentile-hating Jew after you're a Christian, in all likelihood. That change isn't going to be necessarily immediate. And there you go. You have this hatred in your heart for these other nations, or this great dislike of them at least. Before you're a Christian, you're probably going to have that afterward, and it's going to stick with you. And even if you get past the hatred part of it, you're probably still not going to know what to do with these Gentile outsiders when they show up at your church. They're like, hey, I heard about this Jesus guy. I want to hear about him. Which, to them it's like, well, he's the Jewish Messiah. He's our Messiah. He's not your Messiah. And that's very much the attitude. Now, dealing with these Gentile converts then is a very difficult issue. And I want to read you one passage here that really shows this. One of the few other passages I'll be reading. This is Galatians chapter 2. And I don't want to dive too much into everything that Paul's doing here. But Galatians 2 verses 11 through 13, you'll actually get an idea for how problematic this idea was of Gentile believers. So it says, this is Paul writing, "But when Cephas," that's Peter, "came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face, because he stood condemned." That's pretty grave. What's going on here? "For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came," that is the men from James, "he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. And the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy." And then Paul goes on and confronts Peter about all that. But basically you see here this very interesting scenario. Two mature Christians, right? You have Peter and you have Barnabas. Now Peter is the foremost among the 12 closest disciples of Jesus. And he's kind of disciple number one in a lot of ways. And he's the one actually, if you read the book of Acts, the one who first preached the gospel to Gentiles after the ascension of Christ. Remember the whole incident with Cornelius' household? That was Peter. So you have him, certainly a mature Christian, certainly very willing to extend the gospel to Gentiles. And then you have Barnabas, who is Paul's partner in evangelizing Gentiles at a time when no one else was really doing that. They were going to these other nations and these other cities, preaching the gospel specifically to Gentiles. Oh, sure, they went to the synagogue first, but then they move on to the Gentiles as well. So Barnabas, again, mature believer, very much pro-Gentile. Get him in the church. Okay, so you have these two men. But don't forget, they're not just Christians, they're Jewish Christians. And because they are Jewish Christians, they inherit those problems that these Jewish Christians are going to have. And at first, Peter and Barnabas act rightly toward the Gentile Christians there at Antioch. They eat with them. They sit down with them at the table. They accept them as brothers. All's well. But then these other Christians show up. These men who don't really like Gentile Christians. They're the circumcision party. You want to be a Christian, you got to become a Jew, basically. And they show up, and then, rather than telling these people, hey, we accept these Gentiles as our brothers, Peter and Barnabas kind of back off. They don't extend that friendship to them as they did before. They're trying to get in good with these Jewish Christians over here, and so they neglect the Gentile Christians. So you have Peter and Barnabas, mature Christians, caving into these hostile ideas that Jewish Christians had toward Gentile Christians. So you see, Palestinian Jewish Christians, even the mature ones, are going to have this problem with these Gentile converts. It's there. Even if you're Peter, even if you're Barnabas, even if you're one of these guys that should know better, it's still going to be a problem for you. Now, this story in Matthew 15 helps to answer that problem. It brings forward a very strong confrontation, but also a way forward. However stubborn the first Jewish Christians were, they still confessed that Jesus Christ was their Lord, Savior, and Messiah. He was the one they followed. They still very much confess that. And that confession of faith must ultimately undo any belief or practice that does not honor Christ. It has to go away at some point. You're going to follow Jesus. He's going in this direction, so you can't go the other direction. You got to follow him. At some point, you got to turn around. And so Matthew, he thinks to himself, how can I get these ultra right-wing Jews to see that God plans to save people from every nation? How do I get them to see that Jesus accepts even these Gentiles? So then Matthew says to himself, I have to show that Christ himself modeled this attitude. I have to show that even Jesus himself did this. He extended a hand to Gentiles at some point in his ministry. I have to show them that. So Matthew scrolls through his several years with Jesus, looking for the perfect story. He's, searching through here, all those memories, trying to find the one story that really nails this thing. And he remembers this Gentile woman, this very pesky, persistent woman that eventually even won over Jesus, which makes the story even more impressive because in the story you see Jesus change his mind very much. And I know that thought makes you uncomfortable. If you're a Christian, it should make you uncomfortable to see Jesus doing a 180 like that. But the fact is, Jesus at first refused to help this woman and then decides to help her. He goes from saying no to saying yes. And this change of mind is actually great for Matthew's purpose. It's actually perfect because Matthew's readers need to change their minds. They need to pull a 180. They need to go from saying no to saying yes. So he shows them a story about Jesus where even Jesus does this, where he says no, but then says yes, and does this anyway. So it's a perfect story. This is the great story that is going to confront this issue about Gentile believers and how these Jewish Christians need to accept them. And that is why Matthew's readers need to know this story. It very much attacks them right where they are and forces them to come to grips with this issue. So there's my first point. They need to know this story. Okay, point 2. Matthew portrays this woman's situation exactly the way a Jewish Christian would see it. He pretty much loads this up with all the right language and all the right situations here. Now, if Matthew's going to change his readers' minds, he has to begin where they are. If you're going to actually take someone's wrong point of view and get them to change their mind, you got to start where they are. You got to get inside their head. You got to think like they think. And you got to understand them. Well, Matthew, he does that in this story. In meeting this woman, we meet every Gentile who made that first awkward step into a gathering of Jewish Christians. She very much represents that in the way specifically that a Jewish Christian would see her, would see those people. I'll show you what I mean here. There are actually 2 ways this is done. I think 2. Yes. 3. We'll see when we get there. Okay, first, my points are kind of confusing. Okay, first thing though, this woman's ethnicity is exaggerated, which is just another way of saying that Matthew makes a big deal out of what nation she's from. Her ethnicity is exaggerated. Now, to see what I mean, consider some details here. Okay, first of all, this event happens near Tyre and Sidon. Okay, verse 21. And Jesus went away from there and withdrew to the district of Tyre and Sidon. So this is where this woman is from. She lives in Tyre and Sidon. Now, I generally find that these healing stories don't usually say where these healings take place. So if there's a place name mentioned, it's probably important. I've generally tried to follow that principle, and usually I'm glad I did. So Tyre and Sidon, why are they mentioned? Well, these 2 cities are just north of Israel. They are most certainly not Jewish. These are Gentile, pagan cities, so not by any means Israeli by any sense. In fact, these 2 cities would probably have sparked a special animosity in the hearts of Jews. Not exactly the most popular Gentile, if you could have a list of most popular Gentile cities in the Jewish world, it would not be Tyre and Sidon. For one thing, even Jesus back in Matthew 11, as he's giving these denunciations of certain Jewish cities, he actually mentions Tyre and Sidon alongside Sodom as an example of wickedness. So you have Sodom and Gomorrah, these 2 cities that God destroyed with fire from heaven because they were so wicked. And right alongside of them, Tyre and Sidon. So Tyre and Sidon, reputation for wickedness, like Sodom and Gomorrah. But secondly, there's another detail I found as I was studying this passage. Josephus, the Jewish historian that I often mention, he makes an interesting comment. He lists 2 nations as being the foremost enemies of the Jews, right? So he kind of gives the 2 nations that Jews have the most problem with. One of them is Egypt, which you would understand. Egypt is the house of slavery. They held Israel captive for 400 years. That'd be a big problem. I mean, I'd have a grudge too if that nation held me captive for 400 years. But the other nation is Phoenicia, which is where Tyre and Sidon are. So the 2 nations that drive Jews crazier than any other nation are Egypt and then the nation where Tyre and Sidon are. So Jewish Christians are not going to look kindly on a citizen of Tyre and Sidon. They're not going to see this person and welcome them. In their eyes, this woman, this Canaanite woman here, has sinned by being born in the wrong country. So she kind of has that on her already. But furthermore, we can go further with this, with her nationhood being exaggerated, and that is that Matthew actually does call her a Canaanite, which is a fascinating word to use. Verse 22, and behold, a Canaanite woman came from that region and was crying, have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. So he calls her a Canaanite. Now, in a sense, there's nothing wrong with that word. It's an actual word, Canaanite, and Phoenicia was part of the land of Canaan historically, so there's nothing wrong there geography-wise. The oddity is that Matthew uses this word even though it's an outdated word. It's a word that isn't really used anymore. In the time of Jesus, you only encountered Canaanites in one place, and that was the Old Testament. As you're reading the records of centuries-old dealings between God and people. That's the only place. The word wasn't used anymore. It was not a word that was in common use. Now, for Matthew to call this woman a Canaanite would be like calling an American a colonist. We used to be colonists a long time ago, and then we got our own nation, and now we're Americans. We're not colonists anymore. So don't call us a colonist. Well, Matthew, he kind of goes back in time here, and he calls this woman a Canaanite, even though that's very much an outdated word. Now, for reference, to show you how strange this is, in Mark's version of this story, he doesn't call her a Canaanite. He calls her a Syro-Phoenician, which would be the proper term, but Matthew calls her a Canaanite. Now, why in the world would Matthew call her by an Old Testament word? Why would he dig this word out of the Old Testament scriptures and apply it to this woman? Well, the answer is to bring the Old Testament Canaanites to mind, to bring to mind those people that were living in the land of Israel before the Hebrews came in and took it over. The people that were so wicked that God said, kill all of them, men, women, children, kill them all. They're that wicked. Wipe these people off the face of the earth. Those people, the Canaanites. And this woman is one of their more fortunate descendants that escaped the slaughter. That's who this woman is. She's their descendant of these people that were so wicked there was a divine death sentence on them. So Jewish Christians were already unlikely to accept a Phoenician, but then they're even less likely to accept a Canaanite, just given the history there. And Matthew loads on that term there to really push this idea of her ethnicity. She's from that nation up there. Can't you just see the bullseye painted on her forehead? Hate this woman. Hate this woman. Okay, so there's that aspect of this. This detail in which you see her the way a Jewish Christian would probably see this woman. Her ethnicity is exaggerated. Secondly, though, the next thing that happens is the Christians respond with callousness. She doesn't get a very warm reception from the disciples here. Verse 22 and 23 says, "And behold, a Canaanite woman came from that region and was crying out, 'Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon.' But he did not answer her a word, and his disciples came and begged him, saying, 'Send her away, for she is crying out after us.'" Jesus, get rid of this woman. Now, notice what the disciples do not say. They do not say, "Help her." They don't say, "Jesus, give her what she wants, help her so that she'll go away." They don't even give her that amount of decency. They just say, "Send her away." Who cares about her daughter? Send this woman away. Get rid of her. Now, these men have seen great examples of Jesus' compassion. They know that this guy, he has a heart you can pull on. If you show up and you have a need, Jesus is going to help you. They've seen that. And the disciples themselves, they've done some healing. They've been the men to whom people came to saying, "Hey, my daughter is sick. Can you please come heal her?" And they said, "Yeah." They did that. But then this woman comes up and they say, "Send her away. We don't want this Canaanite Phoenician woman following us around." Now, the disciples perfectly represent the way Jewish Christians view Gentiles. Send them away. We don't want them. We don't want to be anywhere near them. This is probably why Matthew mentions it, because Mark doesn't. You see, Mark doesn't mention the disciples saying, "Send her away." But Matthew, he mentions it. Why? Because it fits his audience. This is what the Jewish Christians reading this gospel would say. They're at this point in the story, and they're saying, "Yeah, send that woman away. Get rid of her. We don't want to deal with those kinds of people. Get rid of these Gentiles." So Matthew's readers, they're very much the kind of people, a Gentile shows up at their church one Sunday, and they're talking about, "Yeah, that Gentile showed up. I hope they got the idea they weren't welcome. Hope we showed them that they should never come back." That's their attitude here. They don't want these Gentiles. They're very callous. And the disciples here are very callous. Perfectly represents the way Matthew's readers probably viewed Gentile converts to Christianity, or any Gentile that was even interested in Jesus. So there's that point. And then finally, there were three. How about that? Finally, to close the book on this woman, the healer, even the healer, takes a hard line stance. Okay? So verses 23 through 24 here, Jesus, he did not answer her a word, and the disciples came and begged him, saying, "Send her away, for she's crying out after us." And he, that's Jesus, answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." Absolute, only sent to the house of Israel. That's it. Which again, Mark, he doesn't record this line, but Matthew does. So it's very important for Matthew that Jesus said this. I was sent only to the house of Israel. Now, if anything could support Jewish Christians disliking Gentiles, it's Jesus himself saying, no, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. No Gentiles allowed. Now that would support them. I mean, if you're the Jewish Christian reading this passage, you're like, yeah, you tell them, Jesus, you're sent only to us. You're our Messiah. You're not their Messiah. You're ours. So this hardline stance from Jesus very much supports this Jewish animosity toward these Gentile believers. So altogether, Matthew portrays this situation exactly the way a Jewish Christian would see it. Matthew's readers have their own sentiments reflected back to them from this passage, the way it is worded. She was born in the wrong place. We don't care about her or her daughter, and Jesus himself said no. There you go. End of discussion. Move on to the next story. We've seen everything we need to see. And now the readers of Matthew can fold their arms and frown at all the Gentiles because they have the right to. Because they see it right here, right? So far, that's exactly the way Matthew has portrayed it. But that, of course, is not where Matthew leaves it. He's going to go on to some other things here. Which is my third point. Now that Matthew has given a voice to all of that, he's going to show now why it is pointless to resist these Gentile Christians. Why you eventually have to throw open the door and accept them. Now Matthew does this by highlighting 4 things about this woman. And I'm pretty sure this time there are 4 points. So 4 things about this woman that shows you why you have to let these people into the fold. Now in those features we see reasons for Jewish Christians to end their hostility toward the rest of the world and accept Gentiles as brothers and sisters in Christ. If a Gentile comes to your church, they want to be a believer in Jesus, they want to be baptized, they want to be a disciple, you say yes. And here's all the reasons for it, right here. First of all, Gentiles are victims in the war against Satan. Okay, number one, we're going to go to a very grandiose one here at first. Gentiles are victims in the war against Satan. Now just think about your history here. For so many centuries, God did no work outside of Israel. I mean, he chose Israel, and he chose Abraham, and then for about 2,000 years sticks with Abraham's descendants, who are Israel, and that's pretty much it. The rest of the nations of the world, they're in darkness. God didn't do anything. He just stuck with Israel. I mean, they're left alone to deal with satanic domination and affliction. You know, they're worshiping these gods that are demons rather than gods. I mean, they have no light. They're doing the most despicable things. I mean, there is just darkness out there because God didn't do anything. God was working just in Israel. And this woman represents that very well. Her daughter is what? Severely oppressed by a demon. You know, it's not just this issue where there's this demon attacking her daughter, where it's severely, she's severely oppressed. You thought demon oppression was bad? You haven't seen this woman's daughter. I mean, she's like in the top 10 list of worst demonic attacks ever. She's severely oppressed by a demon. Just like most Gentiles throughout history were. I mean, they're living in the kingdom of darkness. God isn't doing anything to break down what Satan is doing outside of Israel. I mean, this woman is very much like that. This demon comes along and she can't do anything. There are no rabbis, there are no healers from God in Tyre and Sidon. They're in darkness. But now that Christ has come, at this stage in history, you actually see a chance to ruin that dominion of Satan. Not just the things he does in Israel, but throughout the whole world. Now that the Messiah has come and has actually pledged that his gospel is going out to the whole world, there is a chance to roll back that darkness. There is a chance to take the kingdom of Satan and just smash it to pieces, one nation at a time. The power is here. Now that Christ is here, the power is here to make Satan lose his grip over the whole world. So how can a Jewish Christian, knowing that, how can a Jewish Christian close his eyes to a chance to deliver Gentiles from Satan. I mean, here are these people. Yeah, they grew up worshiping false gods, demons, just like their fathers and their grandfathers and their great-grandfathers and the very founders of their nations, however many centuries ago. But now they see Christ, the Son of God, and they say, hey, I don't like my old gods. I want to hear about this Jesus God. He sounds like the real deal. He sounds like a God I can follow. So they come and they say, tell me about Jesus. How do you say no to that? I mean, how do you say no to demonized people who want to escape Satan and come to God? Isn't this a war? I mean, what's the point of war? The point of war is to win. Satan's the enemy, you bring down his kingdom. How do you do that? Well, his people are leaving. I mean, his people are leaving his dominion and coming to the true God through Christ. Why would you stop that? This woman very much represents that, because here she is with the same problem with satanic oppression, coming to Jesus for deliverance, just like these Gentile believers who are coming to Christ and escaping the snare of Satan in the process. How can you say no to that? How can you say no to a chance to bring down the kingdom of the great enemy of God? Seems hard to turn down, really. Okay, second thing though, Gentile Christians worship Jesus. And I'm getting that again from this passage. Verse 25 in the ESV says, but she came and knelt before him, saying, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on me. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon. Okay, she came and knelt before him. Now the ESV, a lot of translations say knelt before, which would be very literal except for the fact that we normally translate this word worship. This is what you direct toward God. This is that word. And if you don't believe me, the King James Version does translate it worship, so you can look that up when you get home if you want to. So it's very much the word for worship. So this woman goes all out. I mean, she is a worshiper of Jesus. He is her God now. That's the way it works. Now, it's strange to say, but in these healing stories, you really don't often see Jesus being worshipped, really throughout the rest of the Gospels. I mean, even the disciples, the men that had been following Jesus more carefully than anyone else, even they did not worship Jesus until the very last chapter, chapter 14. After they saw him walk on the water, then they get the idea they should worship Jesus, but not until then. So they're very slow to learn that. But this woman, she comes up and she just worships him. I mean, she gets it immediately. She is a worshiper of Jesus. Now here's a woman, again, grew up worshiping pagan gods, whoever the Phoenicians were worshiping at that time, but instead of going to those gods for help, she's coming to Jesus for help. She has turned her back on the old gods, and she's coming to the Son of God, Jesus, for healing. Now the question for the Jewish Christians reading Matthew's Gospel is, how can you despise people who forsake false gods in favor of Jesus? I mean, it's not like they're trying to smuggle their old gods into your church. It's like, no, they're done with them. I mean, they want Jesus now and only Jesus. They want the Father of Jesus Christ. They don't want these old gods. They're leaving those things. This woman very much represents that. And again, how can you say no to a person that is ready to burn their idols and come and serve Christ? Hard to turn down. Third thing, Gentile Christians have arguments. And by arguments, I mean they have reasons for why you should let them in the door. Now, this is one of the few times, this story right here, one of the few times in these healing stories where we see someone teaching Jesus. You see, usually Jesus is doing the teaching, but in this case, you see the woman teach Jesus. And see, the way she does it too is really good, because one of the more frustrating things you can do to a person during an argument is use their own words against them, right? You say something, and then a few minutes later they come back and say, but you said this. You said this. Well, this woman does that. Listen to the way she argues with him. So he answered her, it is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. So he says, okay, woman, I'm not going to help you or your daughter because you're dogs. It's like, that really hurts. But the woman, she's not deterred. She says, yes, Lord, yet, even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. Even the dogs get some food. It's a principle. That's what happens. Dogs get food too. She says, okay, fine. You know what, Jesus? I'm a dog. My daughter is a dog. Fine, we're dogs. Woof, woof. But dogs eventually get the table scraps. At some point, you clean off the table, you throw it in the dog bowl, the dog gets to eat. eventually. And that's all I'm asking you to do. I'm not asking you to heal everyone in Tyre and Sidon, just asking you to heal my daughter. I'm asking for a crumb, not asking for a feast, just asking for the scraps. He's able to take his own words and kind of turn them around and say, well, even based on what you said, I should get this. I'm being a good dog. I should get some food, right? You just get a crumb, just a crumb here. Now, how can you say no to that? How can you say no to a woman who's willing to say, yes, I'm a dog, throw me a crumb? I mean, how do you say no to that kind of humility? Now, hopefully, this part of the story would strike a chord with Matthew's Gentile readers, mainly because some time has passed between this incident and the time the Matthew's audience is reading this, about 30 years, maybe more. So by this time, by the time Matthew wrote his book, the gospel had been preached to the Jews a lot. Jesus preached it. He spent 3 years crisscrossing Israel preaching the gospel. Then the apostles preached it. They were preaching in Jerusalem and then went outward. The gospel has been preached among the Jews so much, and yet so many of them wanted nothing to do with Jesus. The feast was laid out for the children, right? You know, it says, come eat, come eat. And the children didn't want to eat. They left most of the food on the table. So now what's going to happen? Well, now that the children have rejected their food, it's time to feed the dogs. And well, if the kids don't want it, here, Rover gets it, or whatever you name your dog. I mean, now they're going to get it. The children, they leave the table. They don't want the food. Now the dog gets it. Okay, the Jews, they don't want the gospel. Guess whose turn it is? The Gentiles. It's their turn. Matthew's readers might have complained about Gentiles getting too much attention if they had been ignored completely with the preaching of the gospel, but they weren't ignored. You know, they were told, the Messiah is here, repent and believe. They said no. They leave the food on the table, you should expect a dog to come and get it. Now, Acts chapter 13, you kind of see this same thing a little later on in history, which is why I want to read it. A little closer to Matthew's time. Acts 13, verses 44 through 48. This is during the ministry of Paul and Barnabas, actually. The next Sabbath, almost the whole city, they're in a Gentile city, by the way. The next Sabbath, almost the whole city gathered to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began to contradict what was spoken by Paul, reviling him. And Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly, saying, it was necessary that the word of God should be spoken first to you. But since you thrust it aside and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life, behold, we are going to the Gentiles. For so the Lord has commanded us, saying, I have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. And when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word of the Lord. And as many as were appointed to eternal life believed. It's like, there you go. Hey, you don't want to eat? Fine, your food goes to the dogs. Jews don't want the gospel? We'll give it to the Gentiles. And by Matthew's time, that was happening. Don't complain if a dog jumps on the table and tries to get the food if the kids don't want to eat it. And that's what's happening in this passage. Now, the last thing here, the fourth thing, is that Gentile Christians can show greater faith than most Jewish Christians. Gentile Christians can show greater faith than most Jewish Christians. Now, there is a phrase that we associate with the disciples in the ministry of Jesus. He says it very often. You of little faith. It's like Jesus does something, the disciples are dumbstruck, and he's like, you of little faith. You of little faith. You still don't understand, do you? You of little faith. You saw it just recently in Matthew 14 where Peter walks on the water, starts to sink, and Jesus says, you of little faith, why did you doubt? I mean, just like, you of little faith. That is exactly what these Jewish followers of Jesus have at this time. They have little faith. Meanwhile, this Gentile woman has great faith. Verse 28, Jesus answered her, O woman, great is your faith. Be it done for you as you desire. So it's amazing. Jesus very rarely praises anyone's faith. It's a very unusual thing for him to do that. And yet he does that for this Gentile woman. So this pagan woman has greater faith than the Jewish men who had been following Christ all this time already. Somehow she has the greater faith and the Jewish believers have the little faith. Now let's have a closer look at that great faith, because we can say more about it. In this great faith she has, while most Jews rejected Jesus as the Son of David, she believes it. What does she call him in verse 22? Have mercy on me, Son of David. Now that's very much a messianic title. The Son of David was supposed to be the great king coming to rule the Jews and rule the world at the end of the age. It's a strictly Jewish idea. That's it. I mean, this is what the Jews are waiting for. And yet Jesus comes. Most Jews don't believe in him, but this Gentile woman, she believes. You're the Son of David. You are. The rest of the nation may not believe in you, but I do. So she has greater faith than most Jews in that she realizes this man is, in fact, the Son of David. One more thing about her faith, to bring this up again, it changed Jesus' mind. He actually pulled a 180. Now, I have more to say on this topic in a moment, but just right now, note that he said no and then said yes. He said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and then he said, you got it. I mean, boom, he totally changed it. I can't think of any other time in the Gospels where that happens. Maybe you can, but I can't think of any other place where Jesus first denied a request and then said, okay, fine. It's pretty rare. I mean, this woman has faith that is so great, it made Jesus say, you know what? You got it. Even though I just said no, I'm going to do this for you. So, what's wrong with Gentiles believing in Jesus? If Gentile believers are like this woman, if they are capable of such great faith, why not welcome them? I mean, goodness, if they have more faith even than some Jews, open the door, let them in, let them be Christians, baptize them, let them be disciples. I mean, just bring them into the church. I mean, what's the problem here? If they have such great faith, why bar the way? This story about the Canaanite woman shows Matthew readers several reasons that they should not resist these Gentile Christians. It's time to stop. It's time to stop folding your arms, time to stop frowning, and time to say, hey, okay, Jesus is your Messiah too. He's your Savior too. You can only do that for so long. You can only resist this for so long because these Gentile believers, they're here, their faith is impressive, and they're coming to Christ, and it's time to embrace what God is doing. They are like this woman, and it's time to let this woman in the door of your church. So, those are Matthew's ways of bringing that point forward. Now, I have one more thing to say on this, my fourth point. It's that Matthew provides Jesus as a model for accepting Gentile Christians. He's going to put forth Jesus as an example for how to go about doing this. Now, Matthew is asking a very extraordinary thing. He is asking for Christians to act like Christ. He is asking them to follow the man they call Lord and actually do what he does. Matthew does not ask his readers to do anything other than what Christ himself has already done. He's asking his readers to change their minds. Well, guess what? Jesus has already done that. He beat you to it. So if he did that, why not you, right? So when they think about this story, I think they're going to see Jesus modeling the way for them, but also see in all of that a pleasing way to go about it, a way that seems less bad in their minds. So the first thing here on this point is that Jesus is patiently skeptical. That's the phrase that I've used to describe his attitude in the first part of the story. Jesus is patiently skeptical. Now, the disciples asked Jesus to send this woman away. Make her go away. We're tired of her. Send her away. Did you notice that he does not send her away? At no point does Jesus actually say, go away. Even though he showed no interest in helping her at first, he didn't say send her away. He didn't do that. He just ignored her, but he didn't send her away. Even though he lays down this hard rule about being only sent to the house of Israel, he doesn't follow that by saying, go away. He just says that and then stands there and waits for a response. And then even though he goes so far as to call her and her daughter dogs, even then he doesn't follow that by saying, go away. At no point does he actually send this woman away. There are three very good reasons there for him to say, I'm done with you, get out of my face, I'm not going to do this for you. I mean, he gave the reasons there, but yet he didn't do that. He didn't actually send this woman away, even though there were so many reasons for him to do that. This is why I say Jesus is being patiently skeptical. Okay, he has this reluctance to help this Gentile woman. He doesn't want to do it. And yet, that does not require him to end her chances right then and there. At no point does he say, well, I'm just going to call this whole thing off and just send her away. He lets it play out. He lets her come up. He lets her come close to him, lets her worship him, lets her talk to him. I mean, he lets all these things happen even though he has this reluctance. Now, that kind of patient skepticism would serve Jewish Christians really well, right? I mean, here you are, you're reading this. You kind of see your own attitude reflected in Jesus. Like, these Gentiles, they keep coming up to us asking about Jesus. I don't know, what do I do? Do we send them away? Do we send them away? Well, Jesus didn't send them away. He didn't exactly jump on it, but he didn't send them away either. So maybe you're uneasy. Maybe you're not sure God actually loves these people. Maybe you're not sure God has any kind of plan for the nations. Okay, fine. Now, can you let them attend your church anyway? When they come in the door, you're going to shoo them out? You're going to give them dirty looks? You're going to say, hey, go away? Well, Jesus didn't do that. He may not have accepted them immediately, but he didn't send them away either. There is room here to be patiently skeptical. You can wait. You can wait. You can have patience. So the first step, just following Jesus' example here, your first step in dealing with these Gentiles is to add some patience to your skepticism. You don't have to go up and give them a bear hug, but don't send them away. You don't have to do that. That's not what Jesus did. Secondly, Jesus has been gradually moving toward this moment. That is, toward this story. Jesus has been gradually moving toward this very moment with this Gentile woman. Now, I say that Jesus has actively, but gradually, been preparing for a ministry to Gentiles. It's been slow in coming, been frustratingly slow, but it's been coming. In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus healed the servant of a God-fearing Gentile centurion, remember? Now, that was pretty big, right? I mean, he is a Gentile, and Jesus does make comments to that effect, but, you know, he's kind of halfway there. He's practically a Jew by now. He's built a synagogue. The elders of the Jews love this guy. He's practically Jewish by now, so yeah, he's a Gentile, but he's kind of already got his foot in the door. It's halfway there. But halfway there is halfway there, right? Is the glass half empty or is it half full? This Gentile centurion, even though he is already sort of worshiping the God of Israel, already kind of there among the Jews, it's still a step in the right direction, right? It's a step toward having a ministry toward Gentiles. Furthermore, Jesus goes on from there. He goes on to the country of the Gadarenes, right? Which I said was a half Jewish, half Gentile region. And he casts out the legion of demons from those two men. Well, again, were they Jews or were they Gentiles? Don't really know for sure. It's kind of a half Jew, half Gentile area. But the point is, Jesus went to that half Jew, half Gentile area. He went, again, another step of the way. He showed to some degree of willingness to step foot outside of Israel proper and go to kind of a half Gentile region and do something there. He kind of moved toward this point. So now, right now, Matthew 15, what has Jesus decided to do? Where has he decided for his disciples to go for a getaway? Tyre and Sidon, an all-out Gentile region. There's no half Jew, half Gentile about it. This is a Gentile region, and a Gentile woman comes to him for healing. I mean, he has been moving gradually toward this point. He took a baby step, took another baby step, and now he's on the line. And now he's going to go over the line by healing this woman's daughter. That's what's been happening. He has been actively but gradually preparing for this ministry to the Gentiles. Now, I say that because change does not need to be immediate and radical. It can be gradual. And there are situations in which that's very helpful, not to just change everything overnight, but to work toward it. People typically fear immediate and radical change. If the new pastor comes into the church and says, okay, we're changing everything, he's probably going to be fired within a month. That's just the way it works. Well, that's how it works among usually religious people. And Jewish Christians were no different, right? I mean, they grew up hating Gentiles. They grew up being told that God hates those people. We are the people of God, not them. That's it. I mean, they're not going to change overnight. It's not going to happen that way. But maybe it can happen gradually. Maybe as they read the Gospel of Matthew, they can say, okay, Jesus, He's kind of warming up to these Gentiles. Maybe I should do the same thing. Maybe the full-blooded Egyptian pig farmer makes you a little nervous, but how about the guy who has a Jewish father but a Gentile mother, and he lives there in Israel? He's kind of already familiar with your Judaism and your Christianity. What about him? Can you go talk to him? Can you let him visit your church? Can you tell him about Jesus? You don't have to go all the way at once. You don't have to throw open the doors and say, okay, every Gentile on the street come in. Maybe you can work toward this gradually. If you're that hard-headed about it, and if you have that much of a problem with Gentiles, maybe you can take it slowly, like Jesus does throughout the first 15 chapters of Matthew's Gospel. So there's one guiding point there. The third thing, and this is the most speculative point, Jesus has been waiting for the right Gentile, which, again, this is very much speculation. This is me trying to get into the head of Jesus beyond what's actually written here, but I think I can make a case for this. I think you'll see this when you ponder Jesus' actions, when you think about what Jesus has done here. Because Jesus makes a full, sudden reversal of policy. He says, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and then he heals this Gentile woman's daughter. It's a 180. It's very strange. I've been drawing attention to it this whole time, and I know it makes you uncomfortable because it's weird. Jesus doesn't do this. Jesus is not a pushover. He's not the kind of guy that changes his mind, especially not suddenly. But here he does that. It's very strange. There has to be a reason for that. I mean, how could Jesus go so far in a different direction so quickly? Well, the story makes more sense if we assume something. And that is that Jesus has been waiting for the right Gentile before he begins to do anything for them. He's been waiting for the Gentile that shows him, now it is time to start this move among the Gentiles. Now, it's a big step to take. Think about this. Here you are a Jew, Jesus was a Jew, and your closest followers are Jews, you're in a nation of Jews, and everyone around you hates everyone else around your nation. I mean, that's your situation. But you know, because you're Jesus, you know that God has this work planned among the nations, and you're the one that's going to make it possible. And you have to get this going somehow, but everyone around you is so inflexible that they're going to make it really hard. So what do? I mean, how do you make this work? It has to be the right person at the right moment. It can't just be some random Gentile walking around. It has to be the right person at the right moment. And I think when this woman survived Jesus' insult, the dog comment, I think when she survived that and kept pushing and showed him just how great her faith was, I think that was the indication to him, this is the right person, this is the right moment. My disciples are going to remember this woman. They're going to remember this woman that didn't leave me alone, even though I ignored her, even though I said no, even though I called her a dog, I called her demonized daughter a dog, I showed no interest in helping her, she still pushed. You can't say no to faith like that. The disciples are going to remember this, and I think that's why Jesus said, okay, now is the time. Now is the time to actually start doing something for Gentiles. She was the right person at the right moment. And that's why you see this full, sudden reversal of policy. Again, speculation, but I think it's a fair one. If you have a better explanation for why Jesus goes like this rapidly, I'm willing to hear it, but that is my guess. Now, for Matthew's readers at least, that's a good observation. Because before you can get a church full of right-wing Jewish Christians to accept Gentiles fully into the faith, the right person has to walk in the door. I mean, you got to have a person, a Gentile of such faith and such persistence and such need that it becomes impossible to deny the work of God in that Gentile. You just can't say no to them. I mean, the other people in your church, they're all Jews, and they're like, man, I've seen this guy. He's a Gentile. I know he's a Gentile, but he seems like the real deal. But he's a Gentile, but he seems like the real deal. And it's like, well, okay, first Gentile convert. Let's get him in here. I mean, the right person at the right moment. I remember, I don't want to say the name, but a certain missionary, Muslim convert. I mean, not very common, of course, but I remember I was listening to this man talk, and he met someone that had never heard of a Muslim becoming a Christian. And this person just would not believe it. It's like, no, I can't believe it. I can't believe you're a Christian. And it took time to convince this man yes, I'm a Christian. I'm a Muslim convert. And it's that kind of thing. It's like these Jewish Christians, they've been so set in this mentality that the Jews are the people of God, the Gentiles are not. They just can't see this happening. But then there's a Gentile standing right in front of them, and they are eager. I mean, they want to serve Jesus. They want to be a Christian. And they keep knocking on the door of your church, and no matter how mean you are to them, they keep coming back. I mean, this person, they're real. You just can't say no anymore. But when that happens, that means when that happens and your whole Jewish church sees that, they're going to know this is the time. And they're going to be able to move forward with a pure conscience and with complete support of that because they know they can't deny this person. So maybe that's the advice here that Matthew would give his readers, you know. Okay, so you have these Gentiles, they kind of float around your church. It's like, what do you do with them? Well, is there one of them that just cannot be denied? You know, maybe wait for that person. Because once you accept that person, then the rest of them will be easier. I mean, once you see the Canaanite woman here, I mean, the Gentile centurion isn't so hard to believe, right? Okay. So there you go. I mean, I think Jesus in these ways, he kind of models the idea there. You know, mix some patience in with your skepticism. Maybe be gradual in the change. Maybe wait for the right Gentile, but still move in this direction because Jesus did this. I mean, he had no problem accepting this woman as a woman of faith and granting her request. So I think Matthew presents Jesus as a model of those things for his readers. Okay, so this has been the case study of a Gentile believer, and I think the story provides a very great help for a difficult issue in the Jewish church for Matthew's readers, and that is how to relate these Gentile Christians. How do you handle these Gentiles who say they want to be Christians, even though they're not among the people of God, they're not among the Jews? Well, I think Matthew deals with that here. First of all, I said that his readers need to know this story. It very much matches their situation. Secondly, I said Matthew portrays this woman and her situation exactly the way a Jewish Christian would see it. And he lays it on really thick. And then thirdly, I showed how Matthew shows that it's pointless to resist these Gentile Christians. The more you study the woman, the more you see just how great her faith is. And then finally, Matthew provides Jesus as a model for accepting these Gentile Christians. You follow his example, it'll work. And that's really all I had to say on this. I do have one more message on this passage next time, which again is more geared toward the idea of prayer and how this woman functions as a model of diligently pursuing God with your requests. But for tonight, that's all I have to say. Are there questions or comments or anything else to say on this passage or the message?